In 1963, women were paid 59 cents for every dollar a man earned. When Congress passed the Equal Pay Act of 1963, pay equality gap between men and women began to narrow, having a positive effect on women in the workplace. Now in 2014, according to the data found on payscale.com, women in San Diego, California make on average 78 cents for every dollar a man earns. It is no doubt that the Legal Reform Institute in 1963 has been positive here in San Diego. But over 50 years later, however, women are still being underpaid for working the same jobs as men. This is not only important to fix because women and men in the workplace are not legally protected, but more and more families depend on the women's wages to make ends meet than ever before.
The face of our workforce has actually changed. Increasingly, it's women who are the primary breadwinners for their families. Women are the primary income earners for a growing share of homes all across America. In 1960, only 11% of families in America with children under 18 relied on their mothers as sole or primary breadwinners. That was just 11%. Today, that number is 40%. 40% of families with children under the age of 18 rely on women to pay the bills, make ends meet, balance the family finances, and actually provide for their children and the food on their table.
To understand and appreciate what has been done, let's look to the past for some historical perspective. During the early years of the United States, women were paid for working outside the home. Not many women, however, worked outside the home as paid work because it was more socially accepted as the man's role in society. With the advent of the World War II in the 1940s, this began to change drastically. As women replaced men in the workforce, after the war, many more women entered the workforce, and the equality gap grew and was there for all to see. Even up until 1963, women were only making 59% of what men were earning in the two-tiered scale for the exact same job. In 1944, U.S. Representative Winifred Stanley proposed the first bill to amend the National Labor Relations Act to end gender wage discrimination. Although the bill expired after it was referred to the Committee on Labor, the groundwork was laid to move forward. In 1950, U.S. Representative Catherine St. George negotiated a compromise bill that would also permit the passage of Equal Rights Amendment. This bill also failed. But St. George, who coined the phrase equal pay for equal work, was persisted and proposed a work bill in 1959 that called for equal pay for comparable work. Although this bill did not pass immediately, the substance of her proposed bill held up under political scrutiny and ultimately found itself a part of the Equal Pay Act of 1963. On June 10, 1963, history was made when President John F. Kennedy signed the Equal Pay Act. This new law now prohibited pay discrimination based on sex and stated that men and women must be paid equally for substantially equal work performed in the same establishment. Since 1963, other legislation has been introduced to project workers' rights and close the pay equality gap. These include Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Age Discrimination in Employment Act of 1967, and Title I of the Americans with Disability Act of 1990. A recent survey of the wage gap throughout the United States shows that the least size gap is in Washington, D.C., at 8.7 cents. Other states like West Virginia, Wyoming, Louisiana are way behind with wage gap differentials upwards of 30 to 35 cents. It has been over 50 years since the Equal Pay Act was signed into law by President John F. Kennedy. Based on a recent analysis by the Institute of Women's Policy Research, we can see that the progress in the shrinking of the equality pay gap has stalled. At its current shrinkage rate, the gender equality pay gap will be closed in the year 2058.
Shirley Ledbetter did not set out to be a trailblazer or a household name. She was just a good hard worker who did her job, and she did it well for nearly 2 decades before discovering that for years she was paid less than her male colleagues for doing the very same work. Over the course of her career, she lost more than $200,000 in salary and even more in pension and Social Security benefits.
We must continue to fight for what is right. Every woman should contact her state representatives and her federal representatives to put pressure on them to get these 2 bills passed, the Paycheck Fairness Act and the Fair Pay Act.
The Paycheck Fairness Act is our next step, but we still have more work after that. There's another law called the Fair Pay Act, which really helps us get at the whole issue of comparable worth, at the notion that there are these jobs that for all kinds of reasons are stereotyped as men's jobs or women's jobs. And surprise, surprise, the men's job pay more. Not necessarily because they're worth more, but because that's how it's always been done. We compare, for instance, a first-year teacher and a groundskeeper on Long Island, and we find out the groundskeeper makes more. Clearly there's a value judgment there. Clearly we need to change.
The majority of the Senate Republicans are currently opposing these 2 bills. They claim that the new legislation would increase civil lawsuits, and some deem the 2 bills unnecessary as legislation against gender discrimination already exists. For instance, Susan Collins, a Republican senator from Maine, believes that the Equal Pay Act of 1963 is enough. Admittedly, more legislation might increase lawsuits, but the facts speak for themselves. The current legislation on the books is not enough, as the gender equality pay gap still exists 50 years after the Equal Pay Act of 1963 was passed. Let's continue to work hard to close the pay equality gap. Let's remain strong in our resolve, vocal and persistent in our efforts to see the gender pay gap closed sooner rather than later.